In this lesson, we're going to talk about some of the basics you need to know about motion blur. Okay, so what is motion blur? Motion blur is a streaking effect that happens to rapidly moving objects, and it can happen to a still image that was captured while the subject was moving. So maybe you take a picture while someone's moving and it looks blurry. That's going to be motion blur. Or it can also happen in a video as you're watching the motion happen. So adding motion blur to your animations is a great way to add realism to those animations that you're creating. So we see that right in here, we're getting a really fast movement that almost just has kind of a popping look because we are not seeing the motion blur of this piece of text moving into position. So After Effects has motion blur built right into the timeline interface, and that is going to be in the form of these switches. So we have lots of different little switches here, but the motion blur switch is going to be this one here that looks like these three circles kind of in a diagonal row right there. So it interpolates or simulates shutter duration. So what that means is the amount that it's moving is going to be changing how much motion blur that the object has. So if something's moving really fast, it will have lots of motion blur. And if something's moving kind of slowly, it's not going to have quite as large of a trail behind it. So what I want to do is go ahead and turn on the motion blur switch for my of videos viewed piece of text. So that switch is on, but you'll notice that nothing happened. And that's because we don't have this switch turned on as well, which enables motion blur for all the layers with this switch set. Now, why do you have to have two switches? That seems kind of annoying. There's a really good reason that After Effects has this built in. So I'll go ahead and switch this switch on now, and you can see that now we have the motion blur set up for that piece of text. So the reason why we have two different switches is because whenever you're building a really large, complex project, you're going to have lots of things that need to have motion blur turned on for them. So I'm going to want to have motion blur turned on for the millions bit of text, and for this shape layer for when this animation happens. We'll get some motion blur there. And even for possibly this text, we may end up animating something to do with this, and we would want motion blur turned on for that. So you can definitely see that lots of layers are going to need motion blur because we're not even halfway through with this project and we've already turned motion blur on for most of our layers. So what's the drawback of this motion blur? Motion blur can slow down your computer. And really what that just is doing is that it's having to calculate all these new pixels for where that image is heading to or going away from. So it's just adding a little extra something, and you have so many layers that have it turned on, it's just bogging down that RAM whenever we create those RAM previews. Now, right now, we still have a pretty simple animation, so I'm still able to move pretty quickly, but we get a lot more layers in here, and that's going to start slowing us down. So what's the point of all this? This switch is going to allow us to turn on the individual switches for the layers as we work, but then switch it off and then not be able to see that motion blur and therefore not have to calculate that motion blur as we're working. So switching on and off this switch is a great way for you to speed up your computer, as well as being able to turn that on to see what that final animation is going to look like. So when I really want to see what something's going to look like in the end, I can turn this on without having to go through and turn on all of those individual switches. So that can just become really tedious, especially once you start getting comps within comps and things are nested. There's so many layers. I don't know where to find this layer. I'm having to drill down through so many different things. Just do it as you work. Just turn on motion blur switch for that layer as you work, and then you can toggle on and off this main switch here. It's going to save you a lot of time, and if you get into this habit, you'll be a much more efficient After Effects worker because you're just doing time-saving workflows instead of things that might make sense at the time you're doing them, but you do them 100 times in a row, and then it becomes very tedious and you've really bogged yourself down. Okay, so now all of that being said, there are some types of motion that even when we check on that motion blur switch, it doesn't register. So one great example of this is this text. Now, we don't have a position animation happening on this text, but those numbers are changing. And you notice that whenever we turned on the motion blur switch for that layer, it didn't affect it at all. It still looks really crisp and almost not quite realistic, just that this isn't changing at all as those numbers are changing. So there is an effect in After Effects that can give you a forced motion blur, and it's good to use on layers that just aren't quite looking like what you want them to when you're using that built-in motion blur. So we can find that through the Effects and Presets menu. Now, we could go in through these drop downs to find it, but if you already know what the effect and preset is called, you can type it in here at the top. And I know that this is called Force Motion Blur. So I'm going to go ahead and type in Force, and really, if I type in any one of these words, it's going to bring up all the effects or presets that have that word in them. So that's going to save you some time once you start learning the names of these. You can grab these really quickly simply by typing them into that panel. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab that CC Force Motion Blur and drop that onto that pale yellow solid on which our text has been applied. So this is something that I can add keyframes to if I want, but really this I'm just really having this kind of in one position at this point. So I don't really want any kind of keys to change as far as the speed of that motion blur. I just want to set the effect up to look the way I want it to and then leave it. So I'm just going to control this through the Effects and Controls panel, which is where we first set up that numbers effect. So now you can see that another effect has been applied and it's just sitting right underneath that first effect. So to turn up the blur, I'm going to be turning up the Force Motion Blur samples. So you can see that as I turn this number up, it gets more and more blurry in between the numbers. So let's just kind of move up right about here where we can really see because we have this blue solid behind us, and we'll begin our work area right there. And then I'll scrub forward to about this spot here where our count up is finished, and let's do a quick RAM preview. So hit that 0 key, and that's going to begin processing our RAM preview. And you can see that now, just because we've added motion blur and turned on a few extra things, now we're moving a lot more slowly. So it's going to take a little bit of time for this RAM preview to process. And you can see how slowly the green bar is creeping up. And also you can see that this kind of is showing the progress of an individual frame. So this yellow bar kind of moving up and up. Each time that that hits, we get another frame processed here in the overall process of that RAM preview. And you can really start to see a lot of motion blurs happening here. Probably actually a little bit too much because sometimes it's hard to even read what this second number is. Now, sometimes I may start a RAM preview and have this work area completely lined out, and then I think, you know, this is maybe a few too many frames. I don't need to see this much to preview my animation. I can just click anywhere to stop that RAM preview, and it's going to go ahead and just preview only the frames that I've set up so far. So this looks like it's moving a little bit too quickly, and that's really maybe more of the problem than the force motion blur. So one of the things I can do is simply drop down through here, look at those numbers that we've set up, and let's make this last a little bit longer. So I'm dragging that second keyframe over for those numbers to about the 9-second mark right there. And now let's just begin a RAM preview for those keys. So all I did was just extend that work area and hit the 0 key to start that RAM preview, the 0 key being on my number pad. And this looks like those numbers are turning a little bit more slowly. So now I'm seeing the numbers counting up at a little bit more of a readable rate. And that's really what I'm wanting. I don't want them to be counting so quickly that I can't read them at all. Okay, so I just paused that for a moment so that that RAM preview could finish up and you would be able to see the whole animation there. And this just looks a lot better. So we're giving our animation a little bit more time to count up, but we still get a little bit more motion blur just from adding that CC force motion blur to our numbers. So that's just going to give it a little bit more of a fluid animation without it looking too blurry. And now it's also a lot more readable just for this piece of text. So in this lesson, we learned some of the pros and cons of motion blur, and from now on, we will want to check on the motion blur switch for our individual layers, and then only check on and off our motion blur switch at the top of our timeline to save us time and speed up our computers. We also learned that sometimes the standard motion blur does not affect certain kinds of animation, so we have an effect we can use if we really want to have motion blur for that layer.